that God has done that. It says, ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made, so men are without excuse. Moreover, God's Spirit speaks to the heart of every human being, drawing him to God. Jesus said, when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. If someone irrevocably refuses to come to God, it is only because he has shut his eyes to the witness of nature and his heart to the witness of God's Spirit. Now, if this weren't enough, Eddie's objection faces an even tougher obstacle. For God is God is not morally obligated to provide a revelation of himself to persons who he knew would freely reject that revelation, since God knew it wouldn't do any good. But it's possible that God has so providentially ordered the world that anyone who he knew would freely respond to his revelation if they had it, does in fact receive such a revelation. Now, how could Eddie possibly disprove that? It would be sheer speculation. And thus I think his objection is simply not successful. What about his second objection based on the commands in the Bible to slaughter the Canaanite peoples? Well, this objection can be formulated, I think, as follows. Premise 1, if God commanded the Israelis to kill all the Canaanites, God would be immoral. 2, God cannot be immoral. 3, therefore God cannot have commanded the Israelis to kill all the Canaanites. Now again, even if successful, what does this argument prove? It only proves that the Israelis were mistaken in thinking God had so commanded them. In their nationalistic fervor, they went too far. Thus this argument is really nothing more than just an argument against biblical inerrancy, which is not the issue under debate tonight. In any case, I think the first premise is false, once again. God does not have the same moral duties that we do. It would be morally wrong if Eddie Tabash were to pull a dagger from his briefcase and kill me here on the spot. But if God wanted to strike me dead right now, that's wholly within his prerogative. How and when I die is at his discretion. And I think most of us recognize this. That's why, for example, opponents of capital punishment will say to its defenders, who do you think you are to play God? Thus, God has the liberty to command the Israelis to destroy the Canaanites. The Israelis were acting as his agents, his proxies. It's important to understand this was during a period of Israeli history when the government was a theocracy. God was in direct command, and this no longer obtains today. It needs only to be added that God never does something without a morally sufficient reason for doing it. In this case, the Israelis did not, in fact, carry out God's command. And as a result, it eventually led to Israel's own apostasy and own destruction by Babylon in 586 BC. So I think God had good reasons for issuing this command. And thus this objection is just as fallacious as the first. Now, Eddie raises a final objection concerning the immortality of the soul, and I'm simply not going to get into that in tonight's debate because there are Christians who are not dualists, who hold to a form of Christian materialism, anthropologically speaking, and believe that in the resurrection state, the body will be raised to life again. So some of these same arguments are actually given by Christian philosophers like Peter Van Inwagen at the University of Notre Dame. I myself am a substance dualist, but as this is an issue which divides Christians, I don't think it needs to be an issue in tonight's debate. So in conclusion then, I think we've seen good reasons to think that Christianity is true, and we've not seen any good reasons to think that humanism is true. And for that reason, I count myself enthusiastically a Christian.
Each speaker will now have a 10-minute rebuttal. Mr. Tabash is first.
Well, I'm afraid Dr. Craig can't have it both ways. He says that the inerrancy of the Bible is not something that we're dealing with tonight, but yes it is, because he believes that the Christian doctrine that he asserts derives from the Bible. He says the Bible says there's only salvation through Jesus. The Bible says God calls people to him. Well, if the Bible is not infallible, then we can question all phases of the Bible. So that doesn't really work. You can't have it both ways. Now, in terms of, he mentioned the problem of human free will, and that we have a right to accept or reject God. But you see, here's the problem. In his article, by no other name, he says that we are so hopelessly corrupt that the only way we human beings can ever find any kind of salvation is not even through our own righteousness, but through the salvific expiatory sacrifice of Jesus. Well, you see, the point is that if our default mechanism on the computer of our very being is such that we are automatically corrupt and sinful, God could have done it the other way. You know, sinful people still have free will to do good, so basically good people could still have free will to do evil. So God could have made us inclined toward righteousness rather than inclined toward basic sinfulness, and still not have thwarted our free will. So therefore, there is no excuse for God to have made us with a basic mechanism that inclines toward evil as opposed to inclining toward righteousness, such that regardless of how good we are, unless we believe in something very improbable 2,000 years ago, we are burnt in hell forever. That is very, very unfair of the biblical God. Now, as far as Dr. Craig's not dealing with the immortality of the soul, yes, that is very much an issue, because you see, if Dr. Craig wants us to believe that for all eternity we're going to be in heaven or hell, he better give some way of proving that there is something within us which we can logically and reasonably have certainty will survive death in the first place, so we can go on to experience either heaven or hell, and he simply dropped the point. Now, as far as moral values is concerned, this is very interesting. Richard Swinburne, the eminent theistic philosopher, has said that if morality is objective, the naturalistic account of it is correct, and morality is based on a set of logically necessary truths. Remember, he said the naturalistic, not the supernaturalistic account. Swinburne goes on to say that torturing children is wrong and remains so whatever commands any person issue. Swinburne, like Dr. Craig, regards God to be a personal entity. Thus, it's unavoidable that even if God ordered the torture of children, it would be wrong. So God's ordering the slaughter of innocent children among the Amalekites in 1 Samuel chapter 15 was clearly wrong. You can't have it both ways. Now, if Christianity were true, then our moral intuitions would originate with God. Now, Dr. Craig's article, in no other name, he admits that he does not like the doctrine of hell and wishes universal salvation were true instead. Well, now, just a minute here. If Dr. Craig's moral intuitions originate with God, then we would expect Dr. Craig's moral intuition to support eternal hellfire. But that's not the case. Dr. Craig clearly states that he wishes universal salvation were true. So if it is the moral intuition that motivates Dr. Craig to desire a leniency that the God he worships will not provide, is that moral intuition to essentially disagree with this God something that also stems from God? Did God imbue in Bill Craig the moral compunction to wish that God were more lenient and that salvation were universally available? If so, then God is essentially criticizing himself. Thus, by Dr. Craig's own words, he is negating the argument that objective moral standards must be rooted in the Christian God, because he has a moral compunction about the way his God is carrying out the process of salvation. And Dr. Craig admits he wishes that all good people were saved, not just Christians. Now, Dr. Craig talked about the beginning of the universe. Now, I agree with Dr. Craig that things which begin to exist in space and time have to have a cause. That is, again, things that begin to exist in, and I emphasize in, space and time. But according to the Big Bang Theory, which Dr. Craig accepts, the beginning of the universe was not preceded by any earlier moment in time. Rather, the beginning of the universe is the very origin of space and time itself. When we speak of cause and effect, the cause always stands in temporal relation to the effect, usually preceding the effect in time. However, if time and space did not exist prior to the Big Bang, then we cannot speak about any cause of the Big Bang, because there can be no cause and effect if time does not exist. As the late Carl Sagan said, if the Big Bang Theory is true, there is nothing for a creator to do. It's like asking what is north of the North Pole. As far as the contingency argument is concerned, Dr. Craig says that everything has to have a reason, but he gave no evidence to show that everything has to have a reason